Elite design, better comfort, more grip. Our new Pure Grip Socks Elite add engineered compression, an anti-blister base, and more grip to keep you locked in. Available now at puregripsocks.com.
While the F50 line was technically discontinued in 2015, the last time the F50 was truly a major contender in the speed boot category was 1 year earlier with the 2014 F50 adizero. It's arguably the greatest speed boot ever to come out of the three stripes. 10 years later, the F50 is back, but has it actually improved? The greatest F50 versus the latest one, let's discuss which one is actually better. Where really quickly, if you guys enjoy the 10 years later comparison videos on the channel, don't forget to drop a like on this one and make sure to subscribe to the channel if you haven't already so you don't miss out on my reviews of all the latest football boots of 2024. First things first, let's talk price, where of course the latest F50 Elite retails for $260 in plain old low-cut vanilla form. However, you can also get a mid-cut version for $260. You can get a laceless low-cut version for $260. You can get a messy hybrid touch version for $270. And you can get a laceless F50 Plus model with a super crazy sole plate for $300. In other words, no matter what, the new F50 isn't cheap. However, the base and most popular version of the boot isn't necessarily unreasonable. Where back in 2014, the F50 adizero was a little bit of a value proposition in that it was recognized as one of the top football boots out there. However, unlike the super hyped up mid-cut Flyknit, Magista Obra, and Superfly 4, which retailed for $275, the F50 adizero retailed for $220. However, that was 10 years ago and inflation is a real thing. Adjusted for inflation at a rate of 33%, these would have run you technically, in today's money, $293. When it comes to touch on the ball, despite the age gap between these two boots, you're kind of splitting hairs here in that I think both of them provide a really nice barefoot feel for the ball. With easily the biggest reason why I think so many people look back so favorably on the 2014 F50 adizero being because of its hybrid touch synthetic upper, which was new for this generation of F50 and also fairly controversial in that this was the first F50 adizero generation to not be available with a natural leather upper. Where all previous adizero models gave you the option of a leather or synthetic upper, so the fact that the 2014 model was only available in a synthetic upper variation was something that a lot of people were pretty unhappy about, but I think once they got the opportunity to try the boots, especially if they genuinely wanted something that offered that barefoot feel, they were pretty quickly sold on how nice this material is, where the idea of hybrid touch was to give you the feel of leather while still maintaining the benefits of a synthetic in that it is thin, it is lightweight, it holds its shape better, therefore provides better lockdown and overall responsiveness, where I guess if you could criticize the leather F50s, especially the ones that had more leather, mainly the 2013 generation, they just weren't as responsive, especially after break-in time when that leather had the chance to stretch and soften up quite significantly. This definitely not as soft as real leather, don't get me wrong, but really does have that nice pliability against your foot. It had none of that plasticky rigidity that I think was typically associated with synthetic F50 adizeros in the past. And from a touch perspective, it was premium, it was thin, but it also just had that little bit of softness that I think made these feel more like a second skin than any previous synthetic F50s ever provided. Where the regular colorways of the F50 featured hybrid touch basically for the front 2/3 of the upper, and then as you can see, it transitioned into this speed foil material, which was basically a more rigid plastic material backed by a textile. It also makes up the top half of the tongue and basically spans the parts of the foot that aren't really going to be making contact with the ball, so they're not super important in regards to touch, but they do give you that little bit of added structure for the sake of extra lockdown and responsiveness, which is exactly what you would want from a pair of speed boots. However, if you opted for any of the messy variants, which did, or at least some of them, had their own name, like Messy 10.1, which didn't really make any sense, but you can see this version of the 2014 F50 features hybrid touch all the way through, which does look different, but ultimately didn't feel that different. There's an argument to be made that maybe they were a little bit softer and slightly more padded around the upper part of the ankle area, but realistically, once broken in, it was pretty much impossible to tell a difference in fit, feel, or experience between the messy and regular colorways of the F50 adizero. Where of course the latest F50 Elite ditches hybrid touch in favor of a material that they're calling fiber touch with a sprint web micro texturing on the surface, which as you can very clearly see is more of a textile-based synthetic material, kind of more along the lines of the speed foil found on that 2014 model. However, this is significantly more pliable, and generally I would say synthetics as a whole in the last 10 years have progressed in such a way where they just don't have that super rigid, plasticky, almost stiff sensation either out of the box or after break-in time. This has really nice pliability to it, feels really solid against your foot, but also gives you that premium barefoot feel on the ball, and certainly offers really nice structure all the way through, giving you that locked-in responsive sensation that you expect from a pair of speed boots. In comparison to the hybrid touch of the 2014 F50, this definitely has more of that raw pingy sensation rather than the softness that this hybrid touch material provides, but it is kind of just a difference of material in general where it's hard to say that one is truly better than the other. It's more so a matter of personal preference. And then of course, you do get that sprint web texturing on the surface of the upper, basically a grittiness that does give you that extra grip on the ball by way of friction that in comparison to the 2014 model is a lot more noticeable. I really like this aspect of the new F50, where on the 2014 model, you can see there's a little bit of like a cross hatching micro texturing on the surface, and that micro texturing did vary quite a bit from colorway to colorway on this boot. It did offer some noticeable grip on the ball, but for the most part, a fairly small amount when compared to the new model. But then there's the wild card of the messy version of the new F50 Elite, which technically features a hybrid touch 2.0 synthetic upper that you would think would be the closest thing to the 2014 model, and in some ways it is similar. However, I still think the closer comparison to this 2014 F50 would be the general standard F50 Elite with its more, I suppose, plasticky synthetic upper, in that it matches it more closely from a thickness standpoint, whereas this new hybrid touch 2.0 material on the messy version of the F50 Elite just has more padding and is generally a little bit more, I don't want to use the word bulky, but certainly has more substance to it than what you're going to find from this 2014 model, which just feels very, very thin on your feet. That's not necessarily the sensation that I get when playing in the messy F50 Elite. It feels like it's trying more so to feel like a pair of leather boots rather than feel like a pair of speed boots. So at the end of the day, it is very much a personal preference thing, but if you had a pair of 2014 F50s and liked them for how thin and light they are, I definitely think the thin, light sensation comes across a lot better in the normal F50 Elite rather than the messy variant. Having said all that, and as great as it is to have all these options, when it comes to producing the feel of the ultimate speed boot, I still think the hybrid touch upper of the 2014 F50 reigns supreme. When it comes to Soulplate design, in a lot of ways, at least visually, I think Adidas have done a bit of a copy-paste, which I think is a good thing because the sprint frame of the OG F50 adizeros was such a big part of what made these feel so good. So the sprint frame 360 design obviously is going to be very similar. They both also feature that rounded external heel counter that was a signature of the F50 adizero, so it's great to see that. However, you will notice some distinct differences here in that the new one has these 3 ribs running as a support structure through the midfoot, where the 2014 model was the final generation of Adidas F50s to feature that My Coach slot, which was at the time a little chip that you could buy separately that would help track some very basic stats when you put the chip in your boots and then when and played. As far as the difference in feel is concerned though, I'd say that the OG F50s do have a little bit of a thinner feel to the Soulplate than the newer ones, but in terms of flexibility, they both trend on the more flexible side and certainly don't provide that springy, super responsive underfoot feel that I think a lot of other speed boots currently have on offer, but truthfully, that was never one of the main performance or feel characteristics of the F50 back in 2014, so it's not too surprising that the new one is more or less the same. However, if you are after a super responsive, very unique feeling Soulplate, the F50 Plus with its laceless upper construction and very unique Soulplate design would definitely be one of the best options on the market. However, compared to a 2014 F50, it's a completely different animal altogether. When it comes to traction, this is where I feel Adidas really missed an opportunity to just, again, copy paste what they did in 2014, because I really feel like this was the best iteration of an F50 stud pattern, where of course it still kind of runs with the core Adidas design that we've been getting since 2010. 4 studs under the heel, and then of course your 3 studs on either side of the forefoot, a support stud in the middle, and then this one has a tiny little toe pick that effectively does nothing, but these more triangular shaped blades in the forefoot made for a nice blend of a little bit more bite that you didn't necessarily get with the more regular triangular studs of older F50 models, like what you have on the heel of this particular football boot, but it still gave you that freedom to twist and pivot that I think did make the F50 feel distinctively different from something like a Mercurial Vapor or Superfly, whereas this new F50 does trend towards being more aggressive for sure. It has the 4 blades under the heel, and you get the blades at the tip of the toe. However, it opts for more conical stud shapes while still maintaining a bladed edge, of course, but in general, I definitely think this does ultimately perform more along the lines of a traditional stud pattern in terms of more so prioritizing that freedom to twist and pivot rather than providing that little bit of extra bite. Again, I don't necessarily think there's anything wrong with the new one, but given the choice between these two, and I think most people watching would probably agree with me, I just like the stud pattern way more on the 2014 F50. While you can make the argument that lighter boots won't make you faster, it's certainly important when you're talking about a boot in the speed category as it relates to feel. And I think why it's extra important for a pair of F50s is really the characteristic that put the F50 adizero on the map when it first launched in 2010 was how much lighter they were than everything else. And after 10 years, surely the expectation is that the F50 has at least gotten a little bit lighter. In a size 9 US versus a 9.5 US, technically the 2014 is half a size smaller. We're gonna weigh them on the scale, starting off with the OG, and you can see that they weigh in at 5.75 ounces, the equivalent of 163 grams, which if we're comparing that to the weight of any top-end speed boot currently on the market, these are quite a bit lighter. Then we'll throw on the new F50 Elite, granted half a size bigger. They weigh in at 6.8 ounces, the equivalent of 192 grams. That's almost an extra 30 grams. I guess we can call it 25, given that this does carry the weight of an extra half size. But in comparison to the 2014 F50, which in itself wasn't even the lightest F50 adizero, it's safe to say that speed boots, especially when you're talking about the F50, are nowhere near as light as they once were. And that's not necessarily a dig at the new F50 because they're on par with most of the other speed boots currently on the market from a weight perspective. I think it more so just goes to show how much lighter and maybe more ahead of the game Adidas were 10 years ago than what they're putting out now. When it comes to the fit and feel on feet, as much as I think the new F50 feels really good, I'd be lying if I didn't say that I thought the 2014 F50 just feels that much better. The hybrid touch upper is just as thin, but just has a little bit of a softer feel on foot versus the slightly more structured sensation of the F50 that again trends more towards the plasticky side of synthetic speed boots, which I think a lot of people might actually prefer if you are looking for a little bit more of that structured kind of locked in responsive sensation. In that regard, you could make an argument that it feels a little bit better than the 2014 model, but I think what made this boot so popular was not only did it feel so lightweight, because it is pretty much as light as anything that's ever been released to market, but it also has that locked in responsive sensation that wraps your foot very closely while maintaining a level of comfort that we genuinely don't get very often in a pair of football boots that are as light as these are. The Soulplate is also that little bit thinner, which I think makes the boot feel a little bit more connected and closer to your foot in a lot of ways. And again, despite the 10-year gap between these two football boots, there's absolutely nothing about the 2014 F50 that feels dated. Where a lot of what I'm talking about is ultimately down to personal preference, but I think given the opportunity to try on the new and current F50 Elite versus the 2014 F50 adizero, I think a lot of people would probably pick the old over the new, simply when it comes to fit and feel. They're just that good. So in conclusion, I do think the new F50 Elite is a really good pair of football boots, and particularly the messy version is currently one of my personal favorites. But when we're talking about the most raw versions of the new F50 versus the 2014 variation of the F50 adizero, can I honestly say that the new one is better than the old one? No. The 2014 F50 has its GOAT status for a reason, and even after 10 years, there is an argument to be made that it is a better overall speed boot than even what Adidas is making 10 years later.